Unless you're a stupidly nerdy football fan, you're very unlikely to remember the Republic of Ireland versus Egypt at Italia 90. It was a drab 0-0 draw, one of the worst games of football there's ever been, apparently. But it is also the catalyst for what we now consider to be the gentrification of football itself. Let me explain. And if you're new here, my name is Ollie. I'm a professor of human geography. I really like football, and I'm doing a series about football and Marxism, of which this is lucky for some because it's part 13. Now, the reason that people point to that game in particular is because it's considered the worst game in what was the worst World Cup in terms of the style of football. There were so many negative games. There were lots of 0-0 draws. And the final itself, when the Germans beat the Argentinians 1-0, I remember watching it. It was a very, very bad game. Lots of fouls, lots of yellow cards and a couple of red cards, I think. But generally, the whole tournament was considered to be very bad football. So after that, FIFA decided that they were going to change the rules. They'd had enough of this negative football, and they honed in on one specific rule that they thought would completely change the way that football was played, and that is the back pass rule. If you're not old enough to remember football before 1990, the goalkeepers could actually pick up a back pass. And so that led to a huge amount of gamesmanship. It was a key tactic in delaying the time wasting and delaying the game. And there was a very famous back pass where Graham Souness in 1987 in a European game kicked the ball like 70 yards back to his goalkeeper in order to try and win the game 1-0. So it took FIFA about 2 years to introduce this rule. But when they did, it completely changed the game in two ways, really. The first is that it made goalkeepers footballers. They weren't just special people who could get in the way of shots. Actually, now they had to be football players and they had to be able to play the ball. Secondly, is that it stretched the pitch insofar as the strikers could push up on the ball. And what it meant was that the actual players had to be fitter because the game was being played in far more of the pitch. So actually, they had to be fitter individuals. And of course, this is coinciding with the commercialization of the game. Loads of money is being pumped in from TV. And then, of course, you've got the millionaires and then the billionaire owners. And it turns football into this spectacular commodity, and the rest, as they say, is history. But what has that got to do with gentrification, which is traditionally something that you see in cities? Within the urban environment, within the city, there's lots of ways in which gentrification shows its effects. But I'm an urban geographer, and I can really boil it down to two structural issues here that are most important. The first is the displacement of the working class and the minorities and the urban poor. So when the money comes in, the existing communities can't afford to stay there, so they move. So there's displacement. The second one is homogenization, where the cultural provisions on offer, the shops, the businesses, everything else around it, that becomes homogenized. It becomes very middle class and becomes of a very specific kind of provision. Now, what starts that gentrification or what causes it? Again, manifold reasons, lots of different ways, depending on where you are in the world. But you can often, in some cases, pinpoint it to a particular event. Look at London with the Olympic Games. East London in particular has gentrified massively since 2012, or indeed opening up of railway stations or subway stations in a particular new borough. That causes massive gentrification in that area because of the increased efficiency of mobility of getting to the city centre. So there's lots of different events which cause gentrification. And so we can say the same with this Egypt versus Ireland game, because if that's the game which caused the rule change, which caused the expansion of the game into this new version of football, which was exciting, which was professional, which itself then brought in all the media money and the billionaires, then football has been gentrified along those same two processes. And so in the same way that we've got the displacement of the urban poor in the city, in football's gentrification, we've got the working class fan kicked out essentially because of the higher ticket prices. They've got to pay for their Sky subscription and they're not able to watch the games in the same way they were before. Now in England, obviously, this coincided massively with Thatcher's crackdown on hooliganism, which is basically a stand-in for that working class football fan. But ultimately, we have that same process of displacement. And secondly, in the same way that gentrification homogenizes the city and it makes the city look the same wherever you go, this happened with football. The styles, over a number of years, obviously, they became very similar insofar as that they needed fit, strong players, direct kinds of football in order to play this new version of the game. It required a very singular, very narrow form of player, which of course, with the increase of metrics and with the increase of fitness programs, they were able to mould this player pretty much from scratch. And so it homogenized the game of football. I'll stop there before I go on too long, because there's so much more to say about how football gentrified in the 90s, not least the culture around it. I mean, look at the music, right? New Order, the England song in the 1990s, that was a radical break from the kitsch, old man style football songs from the 70s and 80s. New Order were a proper band, and it was a proper pop song. And if you want to know more about the fashion, you should go and follow Tiana Pedler. She does some amazing videos on how fashion and football has changed its relationship over the years. But ultimately, the 90s were a really important part of how football gentrified, and in so doing, it displaced the working class people from it, and it homogenized the product.